Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Inside Scientific webinar sponsored by Iconius. This is Liam Sanyo from Inside Scientific, and I'll be your host for today's event, which is titled Functional Ultrasound Imaging in Pain and Pharmacology Research. We're very fortunate to be joined by Dr. Sophie Pezet and Dr. Benjamin Vidal, who will discuss methodology, applications, and new research enabled by functional ultrasound imaging with a focus on chronic pain and neuropharmacology research. And with that, I'm very pleased to introduce our first presenter, Dr. Sophie Pezet. Sophie, thanks so much for joining us today, and feel free to take it away whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Liam. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak today. So I'm a neurobiologist and I work in the lab of Physics for Medicine at the ESPCI. I'm a physiology lecturer and I'm a neurobiologist of the pain field. And today I'm going to show you two studies that we performed using functional ultrasound imaging as a new approach you will see for the study of pain mechanism. I will start by an introduction on acute and chronic pain. So acute pain is due to the peripheral activation of specialized receptors called nociceptors. They are receptors for noxious stimuli that can be either mechanical or thermal, so to the heat or to the cold. And the information that will be coded by these receptors are going to be transmitted to the first synapse of the system, which is in the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. Here they will contact neurons in the dorsal horn that will convey the information to many brain areas that will be involved in both the sensory discriminative or the emotional aspect of pain. Chronic pain, on the other hand, is very different. Obviously, it's the pathophysiological side, let's say, of this function. It is due to an initial insult can be either peripherally on a tissue, on a nerve, but it can also be due to, so it could be an inflammation, it could be also a nerve lesion, either to peripheral tissue or centrally, actually. In all these different conditions, you have an initial incident and then a more chronic plasticity take place. And as you all probably know, chronic pain conditions are extremely difficult to treat. It's very difficult to live with such a condition. So it's a very strong burden. And as I mentioned, there's in all cases, despite the difference of mechanism, some structural and functional plasticity in chronic pain. So today I'm going to show you two studies that my team performed. The first one will be at the level of this first synapse, that's in the spinal cord. You'll see where we studied the vascularization and we studied through the neurovascular coupling using functional ultrasound imaging. And the second one will be more focused at the level of the brain, where we studied through the functional connectivity. So I'm going to start with the spinal cord. So as I mentioned before, the spinal cord is the first synapse of this system. It will be the level of entry of the primary afferents, which are the sensory neurons that are going to convey both noxious and innocuous stimuli information in the dorsal horn. And this spinal cord that you can see on the left-hand side of this slide is sort of like a long track, like a long tube, but with a different level. So being cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral. And the entry, the sensory entries from a different level arrive at this different level, which is what we call the somatotopy of the system. So it's a very organized organization. Now, there's been far less neuroimaging in the spinal cord compared to the brain due to the small size of the spinal cord, but also the difficulty due to motion artifact, due to the breathing. So I'm going to just introduce a little bit about the functional ultrasound imaging that you're going to hear about today. So the conventional ultrasound imaging that you see on the left-hand side of the slide, the principle was to send waves through this ultrasound probe, but in a focalized way, as you can see, and then we transmitted different waves that are going to transmit from the left, as you can see, to the right part of the tissue you want to image. And you can see that you need to insonificate about 100 to 500 transmit to obtain a full image, which takes a certain amount of time. Now, with a technique that Michael Tanter and his team developed, which is multiplane wave ultrafast imaging, the principle is very different. As you can see on the slide, actually we send a planar wave with tilted angle, and using this you can see that in a single transmit we can obtain a full image. So the interest of this new design, if you can say, of imaging, is that it's far more sensitive because it's going much faster, and by doing faster it can detect much slower blood flow, can go up to or down to 1 millimeter per second. And it's therefore increasing the sensitivity of the technique. In that case, what we are measuring is the displacement of particle, or usually of red blood cells in the tissue, in the vein, in the vasculature. You can with very good sensitivity. It also has a very good spatial resolution, about 100 by 100 by 200 micrometers. And it has a very good sensitivity to spinal or cerebral blood volume. As you can see in this image, this is during whisker stimulation in an anesthetized mice. You can see the increased blood volume locally. And this is due to the neurovascular coupling. When there is a local increased neuronal activation, there is a blood flow. Here we measure blood volume. So in this first study that I wanted to present today, we use the sensitivity of this technique to re-examine some of the important physiological elements that was established a long time ago using electrophysiology at the level of the spinal cord. So pending a laminectomy in anesthetized rats, we image with, by putting the probe through some echographic gel. And first, we try to study the vasculature, that you see a little bit of anatomy of the vasculature. And what we observe is this artery that's called the ASA, which is on the ventral horn, but also this ascending arteries that you see on the panel E here. You can also see that what's on the top, actually, there's not much blood flow locally detected by the Doppler image. And that's exactly where the dorsal horn neuron, which is where the neuron that I'm going to be interested in, are located. So using ultrasound localization microscopy, which is obtained using the same sort of probe, but we inject a macrobubble as a contrast agent injected intravenously, what we can obtain is even 10 times better spatial resolution, and is very sensitive because it's detecting these very echogene bubbles. And when we do this, you can see that in the dorsal horn, in this panel F, we can actually detect this very thin diameter blood vessel that we could not detect before with the classical Doppler. So the vasculature is there, as we can show with classical anatomy, like in the panel G, but it's a much slower speed, much slower velocity. So we then wanted to use this approach to see if we could measure functional activation, so activation, some changes in spinal blood volume induced by peripheral activation. And as I told you, my interest is mostly in acute or chronic pain. The idea was to apply noxious stimulation, and the first thing we did is applying natural noxious stimulation with a pincher from BioServe. And as you can see in the panel at the bottom, so when you apply this noxious stimulation, the blue square are the signs of where the stimulation are applied. This induces a strong increase SBV in the cord, and this was measured at the level of the blue square on the top right. This is in the dorsal horn, and this is not significant, however, when you study in the ventral horn, which is the motor part, let's say, of the spinal cord, and not more caudally in the cord, in the green square. So some very strong and specific activation due to neurovascular coupling, which is due to the neuronal activation. We further studied the physiology of this system by using electrical stimulation. So why this? So it's less natural, obviously, but with this electrical stimulation, we can stimulate very locally, as you can see on the left-hand side. We can also apply the stimulus with different amplitudes of stimulus. As you can see, the 0.5 milliampere only stimulate the A beta fibers, which are the fibers for the tactile sensitivity, whereas when you increase, you recruit A delta and C fiber, which are the noxious fibers, due to nociceptors. So when we apply this fiber-specific, let's say, activation, what we showed, as you can see on the right, we have a fiber-specific response with a strong response to C and A delta fibers. And we could also show that this response is an NMDA receptor dependent mechanism, as after you've had a positive response, if you remove a gel, apply ketamine on the top of the spinal cord, incubate, then rinse, put the gel back, and do the stimulation, you completely block the effect you previously showed. So what it means is that not only we can measure the local activation, but also show that this mechanism is also an NMDA receptor mechanism. You probably saw before that the activation was fairly widespread. I showed it back in the dorsal horn. That's this sort of oval red pattern. So now if we look coronally in coronal plane, what we observe is that this activation is very specific to the ipsilateral side, which is where the neurons are known to be activating. Well, that's what was showed in electrophysiology. And there's no spread on the contralateral side, and on the right-hand side of the slide, what you can see is that we show that this activation follows the somatotopy of entries of these afferents in the spinal cord, as when you apply the stimulus in either L3, L4, or L5, you have a shift of this smear, let's say, of activation along the neuroaxis. And on D, what you can see is that you have this shift of the centroid. This is the centroid of the activation. So a very specific activation that follows the somatotopy. So this was never shown before, actually, at least not as a whole, because that's for the first time we can image with a large field of view and with a very, very good sensitivity. And finally, it's known that in condition of peripheral inflammation, there's a spinal hyperexcitability. So we wanted to see if we could image or detect such hypersensitivity. So what we did is we used two groups of animals, some naive animals who received just saline, and a group of inflamed who received a complete frontal 24 hours before the experiment, and this was injected in the hindpaw. The day of experiment, in these anesthetized animals, we applied a brush. They were gentle brush along the hindpaw. And what you can see is that in blue, in naive, this gentle brush induced a nice increase spinal blood volume in the lumbar cord, and this response is enhanced when the paw was inflamed for the last 24 hours. So this is very nicely showing that we can indeed measure the exacerbation, neuronal exacerbation of activity in the spinal cord through this neurovascular coupling. So in conclusion for this first study, the functional ultrasound imaging was a very good approach for us to be able, through the measure of neurovascular coupling, to measure the functionality of the spinal cord and the activation induced by noxious stimulation, but also the alteration in inflammatory states. So the future for this work will be to apply pharmacological studies. It can be used, for instance, for the development of analgesic treatments. But also with the advent of approaches, as you can see on the right, where some authors have prepared some design to do chronic windows in the spinal cord. This is for calcium imaging. It's possible now to start doing this type of experiment in awake animal that will be obviously more physiological. So the second study that I want to share with you today is a study where we focused at the level of the brain, and we studied the functional connectivity. So first introduction on what is functional connectivity. Well, if you measure the signal, here there are ball signal in the brain of an animal, this is a rat brain or mouse brain, and you look at the signal in two regions which are symmetrical, for instance, the primary sensory cortex, right and left, so one in blue, one in red, and you look at the temporal course of this signal, what you can observe is that there is a correlation. These signals are highly correlated over time. And what was showed is that if you extend this study along the whole brain, there is a set of different brain areas that will have this correlated signal with different subsets of correlation, as you can see here. So, for instance, the two areas in yellow are one type of correlation, and they actually are due to the fact that they are one network. And the other one in red, for instance, is a different way to be correlated, and they are a different network. So the functional connectivity, again defined by this correlation, is in the end due to a network. They define different brain networks. And the stronger the correlation, the stronger the strength of this network. So this was information in animals. Obviously, this was also studied in human, and it's very relevant clinically for many neurological and psychiatric disorders in clinic, with a definition of many networks. This is defined either in anesthetized or in resting patient. And it's very important, for instance, in pathologies where there's a cognitive impairment, when the subject cannot do a task, for instance, in the imager. So functional connectivity, therefore, is a very new approach to tackle the strength of the alteration of brain networks. So a couple of years back, we actually showed that we can indeed measure the functional connectivity using a functional ultrasound, as you can see in this slide. This was performed in anesthetized rats who had a skull window to allow the waves to go through the brain. And you can see, if you look at the variation over time of a signal in two regions, identical and symmetrical, red and blue, you see a strong correlation. Whereas if you look to another one, so red and blue are the primary sensory cortex, and in green is the cingulate cortex, you see that the connection is far and is not very good with the cingulate, while it's very strong with the two primary sensory cortex. And a way to represent the result is this Doppel matrix, which are the connection of all areas against themselves. And this anti-correlation here is due to the cortico-cortical connection. So that's this one. Whereas, for instance, with the cingulate, it's this blue and so far less reduced connectivity between the red and green. So in this study on the brain, it's known that in chronic pain patients, there are both functional and structural alterations in chronic pain patients. And the neurobiology and the reason and the consequences of these changes are not very well understood. So in this study, we wanted to measure the alteration of brain connectivity in an animal model of inflammatory pain using FUS imaging. We wanted to define the network that will be altered, and we wanted then to see if there was a possible link between the nature of this network and the pain-related behavior. So the experimental design we used was to induce arthritis as week 0, and then at a bit before the 4th week, perform a thin skull window in all the animal and image after the 4th week of inflammation of the control group. We image in 5 planes, as you can see at the bottom, 3 coronal plane and 2 sagittal plane. The choice of this plane was due to the neurobiological question we had in mind, hypothesis we had in mind. So I will show you a little bit of results. So what we observe is that we have an alteration in a subset of network among all the network we imaged. So using the first approach, what you can see on the left, we use a seed-based approach. So for this, we choose a seed, which is the shape in blue. And we compute on the image all the points in the image that do correlate with that seed. And when you do so, you can see a strong cortico-cortical connectivity in naive animals. And as you can see, this cortico-cortical connectivity is altered in arthritic animals, as you can see here on the right. This can be quantified by applying a mask, as you can see in black here, that will compute the correlation between the seed and this region of interest. So a decreased connectivity in this network, but also in the lateral orbital cortex and the rest of the cortex, or between the right and left somatomotor cortex. Using the same set of data that were from 9 animals per group, we apply another approach, which is to use the matrix of region of interest that you see here. And as you can see on these average matrices here on the left of control or here on the right of arthritic animal, you see there's a reduced connectivity overall. The interest of this is that we can go much further in detail and without choosing the actual brain area. We just put the atlas on the data, let's say. So a reduced connectivity in arthritic animal. So these results that I'm showing you are going in very thin detail, actually, in these different regions, but they are obtained by averaging the correlation over the 10 minutes of acquisition. There's another way to study the functional connectivity is by studying the dynamic of these changes. And that's what we did. Again, that's the same type of data, but just another way to see, to look at different things. So when you do this, you look at what's happening when the signal is changing over 10 minutes. And what we did is we used a k-mean clustering algorithm. What you do is you take the data from all your animals and you try to find a common pattern, which is what you see here, among your data. So we did this trying to find 7 states, different states. And what we're looking here is at the lag, so the lag between the signal. And we defined 7 states of the brain in which animals are going through during the recording. So you can have an example here of a control animal. You can see it's spending quite a lot of time in state number 1, but it's fluctuating between different states. And the same for an arthritic animal. And then you can calculate how much time the animal are spending in all these different states. And what we observe is that some states, like the 4, 5, and 6, are actually unchanged between the two groups, but some, like this other one, are actually different statistically between the different group. And the control animal actually spend most of the time in the state number 1, while the arthritic are a little bit in the 1, but transit to other brain states. And this is very interesting because, as you can see, despite the fact that the animals are anesthetized, we can go in detail in the transition and also so in the brain states and the transition, that's what you're seeing here on the left, between these different states, which is something that is very difficult to do in patients, and that we think is really going to help to better understand the plasticity I mentioned at the beginning in this chronic pain condition, in order to better understand what is this plasticity that takes place in the brain of this chronically painful patient or animals. And finally, we tried to see if there was a link between this brain alteration, the brain network alteration, and the pain-related behavior. And using an approach where we look at individual changes, we saw that the alteration of the somatomotor cortex is linked to the sensory discriminative behavior, while the alteration between the lateral orbital cortex and the somatomotor cortex is due to the emotional aspect of pain. So in conclusion, I think I've showed you that the fuse imaging was, for my field, for my studies, very useful, because it's a very versatile neuroimaging approach, where it helps us to tease out the role of, first define the network that were altered and the link with the different aspects of pain. In the spinal cord, it helps us, through the measurement of a neurovascular coupling, try to better understanding the physiology and the physiopathology. These were done in anesthetized animal, but there's a whole range of experiments that can be done in awake animal, and I have at the moment 2 PhD students working on this approach. And finally, it's an excellent tool to further do other experiments, such as apply pharmacological studies. And this is going to be the topic of the next speaker. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Sophie, for a fantastic presentation. And with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Benjamin Vidal. Benjamin, thanks so much for being with us today. And the floor is yours whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much, Liam, for the introduction to my talk, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to present my work today. So yes, I'm Benjamin Vidal. I'm working at Theranexus company, which is a French biotech. We are developing new treatments for neurological disorders, and we use the fuse imaging. We started to use it like 2 years ago. So yes, I'm glad to show what we have done so far with this technique. So as you already know, drug development process is a quite complex and risky process, and especially if you want to target the brain. And from the basic target identification to the actual approval of a new treatment, you may spend more than 10 years. And a lot of time, the drug candidate development is stopped before that because it will not meet the primary criterion of efficacy or security. And we also know that there is a higher failure rate for CNS compounds. This is because of a lack of knowledge of the physiopathological processes occurring in the brain, or very often we actually don't know if the drug is reaching its target. So I think that there are some key points to verify as soon as possible in the development process. You have to verify that your drug will actually reach the brain due to the blood-brain barrier. You will have to verify the target engagement, and also that your drug has the desired pharmacologic activity. So for this, you could use either a specific biomarker if you have one, for instance, neuroinflammation marker, or you could directly look at brain activity and the functional circuits, which I think is very relevant because if you want to reduce the symptoms in a patient, at some point you will have to restore the normal brain activity. And so to verify this key point at the preclinical stage, you will need some sensitive and accurate tools. And luckily, we have different neuroimaging techniques for this. So this is taken from a nice review about fuse imaging. that shows you the place of Fuse among all the brain functional imaging techniques. So nowadays we have a very diverse range of techniques. For instance, you could use optical imaging that has great temporal and spatial resolution, but it will be very limited in terms of field of view. Or conversely, you could use PET or fMRI that will provide full brain coverage, but with a limited temporal and spatial resolution. And this is quite of a problem if you want to look at something as small as the brain of a mouse. So here Fuse is quite of filling a gap because it has a higher temporal resolution and a higher spatial resolution, but you can image even the deepest brain regions. So of course, both fMRI and Fuse rely on the measurement of brain hemodynamics, but the difference is that fMRI will measure the Ball signal, whereas with Fuse you will directly look at the cerebral blood volume, the CBV. And this is very important because the Ball signal relies on the CBV as well as other parameters. And in this regard, it's less straightforward and sensitive when you're talking about the brain activity as compared to CBV. So I also said Fuse has also a higher spatial and temporal resolution than what is usually done in preclinical fMRI. And another important point is that it's very complicated to do fMRI in awake animals because of the noise of the scanner that could be very stressful for the animals. And you also have to restrain the movement of the animals. Whereas with Fuse, it's more easy to do because all you have to care about is the probe that has to be fixed on the head of the animal. So it's quite easier to do. So, of course, fMRI have some strong advantages. It's fully non-invasive and you can image the full brain volume. Whereas with Fuse, usually we do single slice at a time. Also, the volumic imaging is in development. So I would say that fMRI is more ideal for clinical studies and Fuse is ideal for preclinical studies, especially in mice. So what kind of studies can I do with Fuse in terms of pharmacology? Sophie already presented quite a lot of things. So for instance, in a pharmacology context, you could want to compare healthy animals and disease models in order to understand what are the functional symptoms in your model. You could also do some longitudinal study by comparing before and after a chronic treatment, the same animals. In terms of Fuse protocol, you can do different things that will give you access to different functional informations. For instance, you can do resting state experiments in order to measure the functional connectivity. Or you could also do a specific task or stimulation and measure the hemodynamic response to this stimulation and say, for instance, does my drug have an effect on the brain response to this task? Or you could directly use a stimulation by an acute drug, which is what we call here pharmacofuse. So you have a long acquisition and at some point you will inject your drug and you will see the hemodynamic fingerprint of the drug. You will see what brain regions are impacted by the molecule and what is the timing of the response. Or even more simply, you could see if the drug is actually reaching the brain. So here I will focus in my presentation more about the pharmacofuse experiments. Here is the first example of an exploratory study we did with atomoxetine. So this molecule is a potent norepinephrine reuptake transporter inhibitor that will result in increasing the concentration of norepinephrine in the brain. It is the first non-stimulant prescribed treatment for patients that are suffering from ADHD. And here the idea was quite simple, to map atomoxetine effect on the CBV at increasing doses in the rat using FUS. So with 15 minutes time acquisition and intraperitoneal injection at 5 minutes. So this was a quite simple protocol. We used rats that were anesthetized and kept in stereotaxic frame. We had done a surgery before in order to thin the skull so that the ultrasound can pass. And we image a single slice of the rat brain in order to see the visual cortex, the hippocampus, the lateral geniculate nucleus, and the superior colliculus, because we already knew that atomoxetine have some effects on the visual system. And here are some results. On the top, you can see some maps of the CBV changes in single animals after injection of either the vehicle or the different dose of atomoxetine. So you can already see that there were increase of CBV following atomoxetine injection in the brain as compared to the vehicle injection. When looking in the regions of interest in the bottom, we see that atomoxetine produced transient but significant effects in the visual cortex and the lateral geniculate area, but also less clearly in other areas such as the retrosplenial cortex and the hippocampus. And this was not due to any change in respiratory or heart rate. Quite interestingly, we also noticed that there was a dose-dependent effect of atomoxetine on the time to peak. That is to say that if you see the lowest dose of atomoxetine, it took a longer time before we reached a peak of CBV increase as compared to the higher dose of atomoxetine. But the size of the maximal changes was generally not that dependent on the dose, apart from the lateral geniculate nuclei, where there were clearly a dose-dependent effect also on the size of the changes. Now, in the previous figures, we used manually defined regions of interest, but you could be much more precise by using an anatomical atlas. So this is what we done here. We first developed a method to register the individuals together in the same space. And after doing this, we simply applied an atlas, which is the Sigma atlas, on the same space. And by doing this, you can simply extract the different response in the different region. And we saw that atomoxetine actually has a very consistent effect in some regions, such as in the dentate gyrus or in the thalamus or in the superior colliculus, whereas it's more variable in the cortical areas. Another way to look at the data is to directly look at the significant changes in each pixel of the image. We did this by using gold standard softwares that are used for fMRI, such as SPM and FSL. The idea is to pre-process the data here again by doing spatial realignment between the subjects and some Gaussian smoothing. And then you can do some statistical analysis by comparing different time bins of the acquisition. So first, in each subject, we compare the post-injection period and the baseline period, and then we use this contrast in order to compare atomoxetine and the vehicle. And we could see that atomoxetine produced a significant increase of CBV in the dentate gyrus, in some parts of the thalamus and the cortex as well, at all doses. Another thing you can do when you have registered all the individuals together and you want to perform some pixel mapping, you can add an additional step of denoising of the data using ICA. So ICA is standing for individual independent component analysis. Sorry, and you can decompose the data in different spatio-temporal components. So, for instance, in the figure, you can see an individual ICA that was performed in a subject, and you can see that there is a different temporal response across the visual cortex as compared to another component, which is in the retrospinal cortex with a very different time course. And you can also identify some non-interest components that are very noisy in the image and that are not really located in the brain. For instance, here it was in the dura mater, and you can remove these components and reconstruct the data before doing the statistical analysis. And when we did this, we saw a much more widespread effect of the intermediate dose of atomoxetine. Another way to use ICA is to perform a group ICA so that you can use a different statistical analysis rather than comparing the time beings between them. You can then map the temporal response depending on a temporal regressor that you used. So here we do the group ICA, but analyzing all the scans together, and we identified 3 components with different time courses, and we used these different time courses to do the modeling. And by doing this, we could have some more precise idea of the temporal effect of the drug at each dose. Another way to look at the data and the effect of atomoxetine is to look at the effects on the functional connectivity. So in the same data, we compared the connectivity matrices during the baseline period and the post-injection period, and then we could compare between atomoxetine and the vehicle injection, and we could show that atomoxetine has a complex effect on the functional connectivity with significant decrease of connectivity at the lowest dose of atomoxetine. For instance, a decreased connectivity between the retrospinal and the visual cortex. And at the highest dose, no significant effect, but it was more like an increase of functional connectivity. So different effects depending on the dose. We could also look at this functional connectivity by doing seed-based analysis that Sophie already explained, but let me explain it again. The idea is to look at the connectivity between regions of interest, which is the seed, and the rest of the pixel in the image. So, for instance, here, if we do seed-based connectivity between the visual cortex, left visual cortex here on the image, and the rest of the image, you can see that there is at baseline a very strong connectivity between the left and the right hemisphere. But after a high dose of atomoxetine, you have an increase of connectivity also with the rest of the areas, so the hippocampus and the dorsal thalamus. And same thing for the left hippocampus on the bottom of the slide. Here you can see the connectivity at baseline between the left and right hippocampus, and after atomoxetine injection, a global increase of connectivity. Another interesting thing to present is that it's not, you can also perform a 3D pharmacofuse imaging experiment thanks to the system that we use, the Iconius system. The probe is held on a motorized system, and during the scan you can displace the probe across different slices of the brain. And after this, you can reconstruct the full volume and the volumic changes in CBV. So here you can see on the left with atomoxetine that it produced quite a large increase of CBV, from the hippocampus to the very frontal part of the prefrontal cortex. Another example here, which was done more recently with an agonist of the serotonergic 5-HT1A receptors, which are inhibitory. So you can nicely see that there is a global decrease of the CBV. And in the same scan, we injected a 5-HT1A antagonist that do the opposite on the CBV signal. So really, I think it's a nice way to look at the data by using 3D imaging. I also wanted to show you another study that we did this time in the mice with an hypothesis. So this was less exploratory than the previous study. So we focused on the THN-201, that is a combination of molecules developed by Terranexus in order to treat Alzheimer's disease. So the idea is that donepezil, which is a reference treatment for Alzheimer's disease in order to restore cognitive function, but has a limited efficacy. We also know that astrocytes network are involved in cognition and memory, and notably the role of astrocyte connexins, that are proteins that are linking the astrocytes together. And in fact, we recently showed that if you modulate the connexin pharmacologically by using mefloquine, you can in fact boost the procognitive effect of donepezil in different rodent models of Alzheimer's disease. So here we wanted to try to map the effect of donepezil alone or in combination with mefloquine, which is what we call the THN-201 on brain activity using FUSE in mice. So here are some therapeutic effects that we already known about the products in different models. So in mice that were administered with scopolamine or with stereotaxil injection of A-beta, both the combination of the low dose of donepezil plus mefloquine or a high dose of donepezil can restore the cognitive function, but the low dose of donepezil alone does not. And in terms of neurochemistry, there is also a higher increase of acetylcholine following the injection of the combination as compared to the low dose of donepezil alone. So here again, it was a simple protocol with anesthetized mice and 30 minutes of acquisition with injection of the product at 10 minutes. So either vehicle, donepezil at different dose, mefloquine alone, or the combination of donepezil plus mefloquine. And very interestingly, we show in the dorsal hippocampus in blue that the combination is doing quite the same thing as the strong dose of donepezil in this region, which is completely different to the effect of donepezil at low dose or mefloquine alone. So this is very consistent with our previous behavioral and neurochemical results. So to conclude, I hope that I convinced you that PharmacoFuse provides new insight in the characterization of drugs, mostly thanks to a high sensitivity of the technique. And of course, the very next step will be to focus on awake animals for us. But I think that FUSE is a powerful and convenient imaging technique for neuropharmacology, and it will be even better when we will do volumic imaging. So yes, thank you for your attention.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Benjamin, for a fantastic presentation. And now I'm just going to invite Sophie and Benjamin back onto the audio line. And so, Sophie, we'll start with a question for you. Could you comment a bit about the pros and cons of using fMRI and FUS to look at brain connectivity? And what benefits does FUSE offer compared to fMRI?
Benjamin had actually a couple of very good slides that answers this question, even though he addressed this as a general thing. So overall, the FUS imaging compared to fMRI is very sensitive. I think explained very well that we are looking at blood volume, and it's extremely sensitive. It's more direct as well. We have a large field of view in both cases. We have a very good spatial and temporal resolution. So when we compare to fMRI, it depends very much on the type of imager that the scientists have access to. Some are extremely with extremely good resolution. So we have a matching resolution, let's say. But there are not many of these very resolutive machines in the world. So let's say it's an easier way to have access to a technique that will be sensitive, very resolutive, and it's also extremely versatile. So that's one the positive thing. It's much cheaper as well, much cheaper to run instead of having a big fMRI. Now, if we look at the downside, let's say, of FUS imaging at the moment compared to fMRI, so as the studies we showed you for both speakers, we are using 2D imaging, so on one plane. That means that we don't see the whole brain in one go. So our lab showed last year actually showed a paper on full 3D in one go, and another lab actually in Leuven published this year a very nice paper showing from Alain Urban showing that they can do this activation and then follow the activation of the whole brain in anesthetic or awake animals. So that's definitely, it becomes possible, let's say, and the design of probe is also evolving and changing. So at the moment, it's, let's say, easier and more versatile. But again, there are obviously some pros to the fMRI. As at the moment, again, they can have the full brain.
Excellent, great answer. And Benjamin, what's your experience with this? How do you find fMRI compares to functional ultrasound?
Yeah, I completely agree with what Sophie said. The thing that is most striking for me, which is using both fMRI and FUS, is that FUS is easier technique to use, and you can, for instance, you have less concerns about the electromagnetical things that you can use, for instance, to monitor the animals. And of course, I think the stronger asset of FUS is the possibility to do awake animal imaging more easily. But yes, of course, for now, fMRI for functional connectivity is still the greatest thing, I would say, because of this imaging in the whole brain, but it's very limited access in terms of cost. Like it's like $2 million maybe for a preclinical system, so it's much more costly than FUS.
Yeah, that's a great point. And so, Benjamin, I'll direct this next question to you. What do you think are the specific difficulties of PharmacoFUS, and how do you take them into account when planning your experiments?
Yes, that's a good question, because there are some specific difficulties with PharmacoFUS as compared, let's say, to simply resting state experiment or to task-based experiment. Because with PharmacoFUS, the idea is that you are stimulating with your drug, and so you can only stimulate once, because usually drugs have long-lasting effects. So you will not really control the timing of the response, and you can't use block design, which is classically used, for instance, for sensory stimulation, because you can't repeat the stimulation like 5 times, for instance, like you will do with a sensory stimulation, which is usually more convenient because you will increase the power, the statistical power of your analysis. So the idea for that is, when you are planning to do the experiment, it's better to plan to do acquisition as long as possible. By doing this, you have more chances to fully capture the pharmacodynamic profile of the drug, and you increases the chance to see some effect as compared to, for instance, a vehicle injection, because very often drugs' effects are quite slow. And you also have sometimes a problem that is also so in fMRI experiments, is that you have a slow drift over the imaging session, and so it will be easier to distinguish between the drug effect and this drift if you have longer acquisitions. And the other point is that maybe concerning anesthesia, if you plan to do some first experiment, pharmacophos, on anesthetized animals, you have to be very careful about the choice of anesthetics because of the direct possible interaction between your drug and anesthesia, of course, which is an additional problem as compared to the classical problem of using anesthesia for neuroscience.
Excellent. And I think in the interest of time, we'll just make this next question the very last one, and I'll direct it to Sophie. So there is lots of discussion nowadays about the physiological effects of anesthesia. How do you find anesthesia is perturbating your experiments?
So yes, it can be, we can say, perturbating. The level of anesthesia, of course, can disturb the experiment or give unreliable results. But also, let's say the type of anesthesia will get different results. So this is true actually for different modalities such as fMRI. But overall, my experience is that we have to have a very stable anesthesia and make sure during the experiment that we follow very, very well this level. For the experiment I showed, we had to use slightly anesthetized animals, and we spent some time actually at the beginning of the project to set up and to find the appropriate mix of anesthetic that will give us a very stable and reproducible outcome measures for every single study. And then for functional activation, for instance, if the animal is too deeply anesthetized, we can't actually see this neurovascular coupling that I talked about before. So it's definitely a very key technical issue. But again, that's true for all the modalities.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much, Sophie, and also Benjamin, for your really fantastic presentations, and also for your great insights in the Q&A today. It's been a real pleasure having you with us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And a big thanks also to the audience for joining us today, and also for, last but not least, Iconius for sponsoring this event. So in closing, thanks again, everyone, for attending this Inside Scientific webinar, and we'll see you again next time.